Kia ora koutou, and thank you for joining us for our open Zoom on our advice on agricultural emissions pricing. Ko Charlie Keeling aho. I'm a Senior Communications and Engagement Advisor in the Commission, and I'll shortly explain how the session is going to run today. Before I do that, I'm just going to ask Ben Aves, who's the Principal Analyst in our Land, Agriculture and Waste team, to lead us into the session with a karakia.
Thank you, Charlie. Kia ora tātou, he karakia tīmatanga. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi aki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Ben, thank you. So before we get going, can those of you that have joined us please share your name and the organisation or community you represent into the chat box? I know a few of you have done that already. And let us know where you're joining us from in Aotearoa so we can see who we've got on the call. This session is going to be led by our chair, Dr. Rod Carr, and Chief Executive, Joe Hendy. Joe and Rod will shortly talk us through the key aspects of our advice before you have the opportunity to have your questions answered. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your questions throughout, and we'll aim to get through as many as we can throughout the session. I just want to let you know as well that we are recording the webinar, so if anyone you know was unable to make it, we'll be publishing it on our website shortly after. That's enough from me. I'm now going to hand over to Joe.
Thanks, Charlie, and kia ora koutou. I'm going to take 10 minutes to outline the role of the Commission, the tasks we've been given in relation to this work that we're presenting today, the way we approach these tasks, and then I'll hand over to Rod, who will talk you through our conclusions. We're all here today because emissions from our everyday activities are damaging the climate, and we need to work together to create a thriving, low emissions, climate resilient future, making changes across all of our economy. We all have different roles in this. The Climate Commission is here to provide independent advice to government on climate action and to monitor progress. The government's role is to set the strategic direction for the country and put in place the systems, the laws and regulations that support this, and to uphold Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. But ultimately, it is the people on the ground, businesses, communities, Māori collectives, NGOs, who are the ones who will take the actions that will reduce our emissions and who need to adapt to climate change. Transitioning to a low emissions, climate resilient future is not going to be simple. Making changes across all our systems and sectors is complicated. Ideas that might seem to make sense when looked at narrowly may have knock-on consequences when the bigger picture is considered, and potential solutions that sound good on the surface, feel-good solutions, may not actually be practical or effective or equitable when put in practice on the ground in New Zealand. Making these kinds of mistakes could result in higher costs for everyone, unfair treatment for some, or missing entirely the long-term goals that we are collectively striving for while actually thinking we're on track. And this would affect our international brand and the future that we pass on to our children. So this is why advice, independent of the politics of the day and grounded in evidence, is important. And providing this advice is the role of the Climate Change Commission. Being independent means we can call attention to things that don't stack up, as well as provide advice on the way forward. This means the government and the public who have elected them can see whether what the government is proposing will actually deliver what we want. Having clear evidence-based advice means that decision makers can make more informed choices, better manage risks, and leverage the opportunities that transitioning to a low emissions and climate resilient future will bring. Today, we are here discussing one aspect of the transition, emissions pricing, for one sector of our economy, agriculture. As we have this focused conversation today, it is also important to keep in mind that the Commission has also previously provided much broader advice for the economy as a whole. This has included highlighting the importance of upholding Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, and avoiding compounding historic grievances and further disadvantaging iwi Māori through climate policy. And for agriculture, we previously recommended removing barriers to change and investing in unlocking innovation. This included recommending the government take steps to develop a method to account for carbon sequestration and vegetation on farms and other land that are not yet included in the country's domestic or international target accounting. We've been consistent in this position that more work needs to be done on this, though there has been at least one case where our position was misreported, and it aligns with what we say in our most recent advice. Rod will cover this when he talks next. Agriculture is a major part of our economy and landscape and has a critical role to play in our transition to a thriving, climate resilient and low emissions future. It is important to recognise that many farmers have already made progress in reducing emissions, but further changes on many other farms can lower emissions on farm while maintaining or even improving productivity. In 2019, the government put in place plans to incentivise farmers through emissions pricing and have this set up and running by 2025. Off the back of this, the Hei Waka Ika Noa partnership was established to do the preparatory work. And the Climate Change Commission was tasked with providing 2 specific pieces of advice to help the government make its decisions. These 2 pieces of advice were, first, our agricultural assistance report, where we were asked to advise on how to approach financial assistance alongside an emissions pricing system. Second, our agricultural progress assessment, where we were asked to assess progress towards getting the system working and identifying what more needs to happen to have it up and running by the 1st of January 2025. In addition to our work, the Hei Waka Ika Noa partnership has developed its own proposal for pricing agricultural emissions outside of the ETS. And the government will also consider this when making its decisions. In undertaking our work on agricultural assistance, we considered how practical, effective, and equitable different options might be. This work had a narrow scope. We were not asked to provide advice on other forms of assistance that might be required, for example, extension and planning support, research and development, and support to develop supply chains for alternative products. But these were all areas of focus in our advice last year. The agricultural assistance advice had the same deadline as the advice from Hei Waka Ika Noa on emissions pricing. This meant our work did not include an assessment of their final proposal. The second piece of advice that we're here to focus on today is the assessing agricultural progress. For this work, our assessment looked at the agricultural sector's progress towards measuring and reporting agricultural emissions at the farm level, making sure that farms have effective plans in place to manage emissions. To determine readiness for a pricing system, we also needed a yardstick to compare against because there are many different ways that the government could choose to price agricultural emissions. We assessed readiness against 3 different variations of emissions pricing. First, an alternative farm level system outside the ETS. Second, pricing emissions at the farm level within the ETS. Third, pricing emissions at the processor level within the ETS. Against each of these, we assessed how ready will the system be to implement on the 1st of January 2025? How ready will farmers and the sector be to participate in the system? And will the system give farmers the freedom to identify and be rewarded for emission reduction actions on their farms in response to the price? We considered what support farmers might need for agricultural emissions pricing and any barriers that could prevent farmers in the sector from participating in this pricing scheme. Our advice is drawn on the best available evidence, and engagement played an important role as we developed our advice. There are some specific matters that we needed to take into account when doing our work, including current and upcoming requirements on farmers, existing and future technology, social circumstances, how impacts are distributed, and the Crown-Māori relationship. For a pricing scheme to be effective, it must drive emissions reductions while being practical to participate in. An equitable scheme is one that is workable for a range of farm types, including for iwi Māori collectively owned land, and that manages social, cultural, and environmental impacts. Our advice didn't cover all issues regarding agricultural emissions pricing, just readiness. For example, we have not commented on the price level or how it should be determined. We have not examined all aspects of He Waka Eke Noa's proposal. For example, we have not commented on governance of the system. Our job here was to assess readiness for pricing to achieve legislated targets, not whether those targets should be adjusted. That comes in 2024. With that overview of our process, I'm now going to pass over to Rod to talk about the conclusions from this latest piece of work. Thank you.
Kia ora everybody, ana mana ana iwi tēnā koutou kakara, ko Rod Carr aho. Thank you, Joe, for a comprehensive roundup. And for those of you who have read our report in detail, none of that will come as a surprise. Let me very quickly work you through our broad conclusions. First, the Commission looked at what is essentially the default setting under the changes to the Climate Change Response Act put in place in 2019. And the default setting was to include farms as points of obligation in the emissions trading scheme. That would have created at least 23,000 points of obligation and required farmers to not only assess how many units of the NZ system it needed to buy, but to go through a procurement process. It would have also been inconsistent with the split gas approach, which has identified and set a quantitative reduction target for biogenic methane. In assessing farmers' readiness and the system's readiness to take on 23,000 additional points of obligation, the Commission concluded not only that it was not practical to include those points of obligation in our emissions trading scheme, but it was unlikely, given our split gas approach and the focus on biogenic methane, that the outcomes would be consistent with achieving our statutory targets for emissions. Therefore, on the basis of effectiveness and practicality, the Commission does not and did not support the inclusion of farms as points of obligation with the emissions trading scheme. In the legislation, not only was there a default, there was also a backstop. And the backstop measure was if an alternative pricing mechanism cannot be found, agreed and put in place by the 1st of January 2025, then under the Act, at the processor level, in other words, the dairy company or meat company level, there would be a national average standard quantity of emissions that would be priced and paid for by the processor, effectively being a cost ultimately to the producers of largely meat and milk protein. Our assessment was that including emissions pricing at the processor level was practical and could be implemented by the 1st of January 2025. But our conclusion was that it was likely that at the processor level pricing, there would be little effectiveness in rewarding farmers who moved towards or already had adopted lower emitting farm practices and land uses. That left us with assessing the readiness of the system, farmers and support structures, including government agencies, the readiness of the system to engage in an emissions pricing system for agriculture at the farm level. And not surprisingly, while we were not required to provide a line-by-line evaluation of the He Waka Eke Noa proposal, it was a logical starting point given the enormous amount of effort broad range of stakeholders engaged, and the consultation process which had been undertaken in preparing that proposal to start with it as a form of farm level pricing. So I remind you, the Commission has concluded that pricing agricultural emissions at the farm level has the highest prospect of allowing emissions reductions in line with statutory targets to be achieved in a timely, efficient, and equitable manner. Of course, the devil is always then in the detail. So headline news is we agree with the farming community and He Waka Eke Noa's partnership proposal that we should move towards establishing emissions pricing for agricultural emissions at the farm level. As Joe also said, it was not our task to undertake a review of all the elements of He Waka Eke Noa's proposal, which the government will need to evaluate and make decisions about. Ours was to assess readiness for participation in farm level pricing. Our conclusion was that even the simple form, let alone the more detailed form of He Waka Eke Noa's proposal, was unlikely to be able to be implemented by the 1st of January 2025, the statutory deadline for agricultural emissions pricing to become effective in New Zealand, 17 years after the original proposal to price agricultural emissions from 2008. We then looked at what would a basic farm level pricing system look like if you started with He Waka Eke Noa's architecture, but figured out what the major impediments to effective implementation would be. And by effective, we don't just mean getting it working, we mean effective in reducing emissions. One of the conclusions the Commission reached, which is somewhat different from He Waka Eke Noa's architecture, is that for emissions pricing to be effective in reducing emissions, that farmers need to face a price that rewards them for adopting low emission farming practices and land uses. And that the more that price is shaded or muted, then the less effective will be agricultural pricing in rewarding farmers for those low emission practices. We also identified that in a split gas world, how we treat sequestration is important. We have already established in New Zealand a way of pricing long life gases emitted and carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere. That is the emissions pricing scheme. It seeks to put a price on both the emissions of those long-lived gases and the sequestration of long-lived gases, largely carbon dioxide. That price needs to be transparent, but our advice is also that the ETS is not yet mature or perfectly formed, and more research and science and better measurement techniques should be deployed to increase the scope of sequestration, which would be eligible to be included in the emissions trading scheme. Any scheme, whether it's measuring emissions or sequestration, will have transaction costs and be limited by the available science and measurement technologies. That's a reason to continue to evolve both sides of the scheme, what is emitted and therefore priced, and what is removed and therefore valued. That work we encourage the government to undertake and accelerate in Anaia Tonu Nei, our advice provided last year. So it is not true to say that the Commission does not want or recommend that farmers get recognition for sequestration on their farms. What we have said, though, is that establishing a completely parallel emissions sequestration system to sit outside the emissions trading scheme, create different measures of sequestration, different pricing for the sequestration, in order to deliver essentially what is financial assistance to offset the impact of emissions pricing, is an expensive, complicated, impractical, and inequitable way of delivering financial assistance. We also say that vegetation, whether on or off farm, can contribute a wide range of ecosystem services, including sequestration, but not limited to sequestration, that should be investigated and valued in a separate system. That it is important we don't undermine the goals and purposeness and effectiveness of the emissions trading scheme, but it is equally recognised that the eco-services such as water quality enhancement, erosion control, and biodiversity protection are valuable and valued by our society. That's why we provided the advice that these aspects should be recognised and rewarded, but not limited only to their carbon sequestration. It is important to recognise that the offset nature of some claims is increasingly viewed with scepticism in global markets. In respect of nitrogen or synthetic fertiliser, the science and measurement techniques that are currently available would not enable cost-effective measurement of the actual emissions from a tonne of synthetic fertiliser distributed at a particular time on a particular farm. We do know that the emissions are different depending on the soil class, the gradient of the land, how long before or after rainfall that fertiliser was distributed. But the practicality and cost of measuring that at the farm level led the Commission to conclude that for the time being, the emissions associated with synthetic fertiliser were most effectively, efficiently levied at the importer or manufacturer of the fertiliser. But we leave open the opportunity for essentially farm level pricing of those emissions as the science and technology for measurement evolves. So in summary, our principal advice is that we support the move to a farm level emissions pricing system as being most compatible with both the emissions targets that have been set by Parliament and rewarding lower emission farm practices and land uses. We support the idea that over time, a basic system should be evolving to provide more granularity about what is counted on both sides of the ledger at farm level. We don't support a complex measurement system for carbon sequestration outside the ETS as a way of delivering financial assistance for farmers facing agricultural emissions pricing. We do, however, establish in our advice on financial assistance the criteria that should be considered when financial assistance is being provided to assist in the transition. So I look forward to your questions, but just before we move to the questions, let me also outline what happens next. We have provided our advice on the narrow scope of issues that Parliament asked the Commission to provide advice on. He Waka Eka Noa have provided a proposal for the government to consider as a possible way of pricing emissions at the farm level. Officials will be trawling through all of that advice and their own evidence to provide advice to the government on what government should do by the end of the year to price agricultural emissions. Therefore, our principal opportunity and obligation is not to advocate for the Commission's views, but to explain them. And in explaining them, to add to the public debate that we need to have in order to give effect to a move towards lower emission agricultural products and land use. Your turn, question time. Charlie, you're our facilitator. Thank you, everybody, for listening today.
Thank you so much, Rod and Joe. That was great to hear from you both. And I hope everyone found that useful and insightful. So we'll get going with our first question. What's the rationale for pricing synthetic nitrogen at the processor level?
I'm happy to restate that the science shows us that a ton of fertilizer spread on a piece of land has a different emissions profile depending on the gradient of the land, the soil types, whether it was before or after rainfall. But the measurement of that at farm level is expensive and complicated to do at scale. That therefore, even at farm level, you would revert to a national average pricing of those emissions. The conclusion the Commission reached is that in order to be ready for agricultural emissions pricing by the 1st of January 2025, pricing synthetic fertilizer at the producer or importer level was more practical, i.e. it could be implemented, but more importantly, it would cover all of the emissions from fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer, not just the emissions from fertilizer spread by livestock farmers or by farmers who spread more than 40 tonnes a year. That we think is more equitable, that all the emissions from synthetic fertilizer are priced, not just some users of synthetic fertilizer.
Thanks, Rod. Do you recommend a system that is similar to the ETS in regard to trading, or will it be a levy system?
We don't answer the question, which is at the root of this, is how would the price for biogenic methane, how would the price for biogenic methane be determined? That clearly is an important question. The architecture for the answer is that the price for biogenic methane should be what is called target consistent. In other words, it's a price that doesn't need to relate to either the GWP star or GWP 100 debate that is afoot, because we have already set a target for the quantity of emissions arising from biogenic methane, then the price needs to be target consistent to the extent that changing farming practices, such as breeding and feeding, or changing land use, put us on track for at least a 10% reduction in biogenic methane emissions by 2030, then price will play a lower part in the game. If we're not on track as a result of land use changes or practices in farming, then the price would need to be higher to be target consistent. So in some ways, by agreeing to split the gases and agreeing that price is a tool to achieve an already agreed target, then the question is how and who should set that target consistent price.
Thanks, Rod. So farming is an important part of the economy. Why should it be brought into an emissions pricing system at all?
So let me answer and I'll let Joe supplement. But the answer in part is farming is about 6% of New Zealand's GDP and provides about 6% of our labour force employment. Farming, because it is largely in provincial rural New Zealand, also creates an estimated 250,000 jobs in New Zealand. Farming is an important part of not only our domestic economy, but also the way we pay our way in the world. So nobody is going to argue or try and minimise the importance of farming and farm earnings and the part that farming plays in New Zealand culture and society. However, the reality is that emissions are priced by the world. The world has decided that you as a country can set a nationally determined contribution. That is your claim on the global commons, which is the atmosphere's ability to absorb greenhouse gases without causing a warmer world to become even warmer in the future. So how much of that is done through domestic action and how much is done through international payments is left up to each nation state. And when it comes to domestic action, how much is done by reducing gross emissions and how much is done by offsets or sequestration is a national policy choice. So for New Zealand, our greenhouse gas emissions profile, as seen and measured by the world, puts about half of our emissions as arising from agriculture. It is interesting that it is about 20% of our long-lived gases, as well as a substantial proportion of our overall emissions profile. So we cannot achieve our international obligations without substantial foreign payments, and we cannot achieve our domestic targets unless we incentivize and reward lower emission agricultural practices and land use. That's why we need to address emissions from agriculture.
I might just add to that, Rod. Just going back to that question around the levy versus trading, I just thought I'd note that in our work, we did find that with farmers and the large number of points of obligation at a farm level, trading would be a complication, and that should be factored in when making an assessment of whether it should be a pure levy or tradable credits of some sort. Back to you, Charlie.
Thank you both. And we have had a question through that I just thought would be worth clarifying. Is there any prospect that the Minister will give you the task of assessing Hawak Ekanoa? Now that's not something that's currently in our scope, and we can't answer that, and that's something that would be up to the Minister to request. I don't know if Rod or Joe, you have anything to add to that, or satisfied that that's...
Well, what I can say is the Minister's given no signal that he would have such a desire, and secondly, I don't think he necessarily would want us to do that. I think officials are quite capable of evaluating the wider aspects of the Hawaka Ekanoa proposal, and the process has now moved from the Commission's advice as required into the next stage of the evaluation of a farm level pricing system.
Thanks, Rod. So Rod mentioned the potential to increase the scope for carbon sequestration to earn carbon credits. Could things that reduce carbon emissions, such as new renewable generation, also earn carbon credits in the future?
The limits of carbon markets is a fascinating challenge. It would seem likely that if we think of our emissions trading scheme as the way in which we put a price on long-lived gases that are emitted, and we recognise removals of long-lived gases, which is largely carbon dioxide from the air, that what happens next is individual emitters and those holding technology to reduce or remove emissions from the air will respond to the emissions price that they see in the emissions trading scheme. So you wouldn't necessarily then go about allocating units for emissions avoided. You would allocate units for removals, but not for emissions avoided. And essentially, giving units for renewable electricity is giving units for emissions avoided rather than for carbon removed. And the real challenge at the moment is that it has been estimated that true removals that are permanent and additional are less than 100,000 tonnes of the 55 billion tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions every year. That the rest is nature-based, largely forest removals, and there is increasing concern that those removals may not be permanent, are often not additional, may not be auditable, and may never be enforceable. And so there is growing skepticism about the net and increasing interest in what our country's plans to reduce their gross emissions.
Thanks, Rod. Has the Commission looked at the costs involved of farmers participating in a farm level system?
We did not do our own analysis. He Waka Eke Noa had done quite extensive analysis of the administrative costs of first building and then operating their system. Our recommendation to price synthetic fertiliser at the processor level will have reduced those estimates of costs to administer, and our recommendation not to include as yet unmeasured sequestration on farms will have further reduced the cost to farmers of that system. In addition, if the scope of what can be included in sequestration within the ETS is extended, then there may be farmers who wish to enter the ETS who currently do not. And it is interesting to observe that not all farmers with ETS eligible vegetation have even sought to register that vegetation. It's not entirely clear why that is the case. Sometimes it's administrative burden and complexity. Sometimes it's a deliberate choice not to want to take on the obligation and liabilities that go with getting the credit. And so there will be different choices about who wants to participate in recognised credit for sequestration.
Thanks, Rod. In assessing the readiness of the agriculture sector to come into a farm level system with regards to measurement and administration, did you consider the readiness of the sector to actually meet domestic targets and reduce emissions?
So your turn. You can field that one.
Yeah. So one of our key questions was when we assessed the 3 different pricing options was around assessing the readiness for farmers and the wider sector to participate in the system. So yeah, so that was a core part of our analysis in this piece of advice.
Thanks both. Sorry, I'm just going to check for another question. We've got a few more coming through now. How have you engaged with iwi Māori in forming this advice? What have you recommended?
Jo, why don't you pick up how we've undertaken that engagement?
Yeah, sure. So we have built on, first of all, the engagement and consultation through the first 2 years of the Commission's work, where we engaged extensively across New Zealand, including with iwi Māori, and we took away some very key learnings from that engagement that apply here. We also engaged with the specific working group that informed He Waka Eke Noa's analysis during their process. And then, of course, we were observers in terms of their engagement and consultation through their process. In terms of our recommendations, we particularly highlight the challenges around Māori collective land, which has a whole lot of different constraints and governance structures on it, which makes changing to lower emissions options more challenging than freehold land. So we have recommendations and advice specifically targeting that. Rod, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the first thing is, I think what I've come to understand in the last 2.5 years is the incredible diversity across iwi Māori about their interests and the challenges they face and the historical circumstances that have given rise to their current land tenure and land use. And therefore, it's actually quite hard to talk about iwi Māori as if they were the one thing with the one view. In some cases, you've got very small fragmented holdings of land held by a relatively large number of beneficial interests. In others, you've got fully corporatized operating entities that look indistinguishable from agricultural companies held and owned by not iwi Māori groups. You've got some who are more focused on creating kai for their own communities than creating products for export. You've got some who view the forest as an integral part of what it makes them, their land, their culture, and their community. You've got others who see forest as a source of revenue to enable their communities to prosper. So that was my first learning is wow, you've got to get down deep in the dirt with the people locally to understand their cases, their stories, their constraints, and their opportunities. Secondly, I think Joe has nailed it in terms of collectively owned land. The whole idea of markets and pricing is that investors and producers facing those prices will make choices. If you can't make choices because the land tenure, the way it is owned and held, constrains those choices, then there is a legitimate case to consider the limits of markets in getting the outcomes you want and what other interventions are needed or what barriers need to be reduced. And I would also make the observation that Māori are affected in many ways by emissions pricing, not just in agriculture, but throughout society. To the extent Māori are disproportionately represented in lower socioeconomic groups, we do identify that putting a price on emissions is a regressive form of payment, that lower income households will face a higher proportional impact because of the lifestyles and livelihoods that they have as the world moves to put a price on emissions and move to lower emitting lifestyles and rewarding lower emitting ways of earning an income. So there are many dimensions to a very sensible question. How do we engage as locally as possible? Who do we engage with? As wide a cross-section of iwi and Māori as we can. Are we constrained? Yes, by time and resources. Have we done enough? Not as much as we like to, not as much as we need to. And we, throughout our advice, strongly recommend that the government, who are better placed to fulfill treaty obligations as the treaty partner, do take into account all of the matters that Māori are adversely impacted in a transition by.
Just to cap that question, in our advice, we specifically recommend that the government should consult with iwi Māori as it develops its final advice, its final decisions for the end of the year.
Can I make one slightly ad hoc observation, and the team will challenge me on this. So attribute this to me, not to the Commission. In our advice, where we say that we think there should be recognition and reward for vegetation, whether on farmland or not, to recognise the ecosystem services provided in terms of not only, but including sequestration, but also the support for biodiversity, which is a source of resilience in a changing climate. Also to recognise that vegetation reduces erosion, which is a significant problem in terms of water quality, that a system that recognises those aspects of vegetation and is not purely and solely limited to counting sequestration is likely to stand us in better stead in years and decades to come than trying to fudge the carbon sequestration into a credit as a form of financial assistance to offset a liability for emissions pricing. There is a much bigger and more important agenda that shouldn't be undermined by the short-term possibility of counting in an emissions system a costly and parallel but very limited attribution of value to sequestration by vegetation.
Thank you both. We've received a couple of questions about the same thing. It might be a bit out of scope of this work, but I thought it was worth putting them to you to clarify our role in this. So we understand your concerns regarding the complexity of the sequestration model proposed. What would you consider a better method for recognising and rewarding from the outset the ecosystem services provided? And the similar question is, what is the Commission's view on the practicality of setting up a scheme that recognises ecosystem services in line with when greenhouse gas pricing kicks in?
Well, to be fair, we have not done the kind of detailed work that would say what would such a system look like and how and by when could it be implemented. We did in Anaya Tōnunei, so more than a year ago, recommend that the government undertake the work to begin to understand a methodology and an implementation pathway. The Climate Change Commission is focused, not surprisingly, on a narrower set of environmental issues than would be covered by such a scheme or system. That our preference is that work also be done on the scientific evidence and available measurement techniques to include a broader range of matter that is genuinely sequestering carbon within the ETS. But remember, to be included, it comes with obligations to maintain permanence and liabilities if that carbon captured and stored is released. It's not a free ride. And that's why some farmers with woody vegetation eligible for the ETS choose not to submit it to the ETS.
Thanks, Rod. Why are we worried about methane at all if it's just a short-lived gas?
Okay, I am not a climate scientist, but I did sit down and have a very useful conversation with Dave Frame and others over time. The first thing is that we've allowed the language to slip a little. What we're interested in is the warming effect of a gas, not its life. So it is true that scientifically the half-life of a methane molecule, whether it's biogenic or fossil, the planet just sees it as methane, the half-life of methane molecule in the atmosphere is about 10 years. And after 20 years, almost all of it has decomposed into carbon dioxide and water vapor, right? So you're left with a carbon dioxide molecule that then hangs around in the atmosphere like any carbon dioxide. The warming effect is when you first release methane at the beginning of that 20-year period, it creates a pulse of warming that is unrelated to its life as a gas. And that forcing effect in its first 20 years is about 86 times what 1 ton of carbon dioxide would do in terms of adding warming. And of course, the argument is then, if your methane emissions are steady for 20 years, your methane is decomposing at the same rate that you're adding it, so you are not adding to the warming of the world. But by holding a given level of methane in the atmosphere, you have staked a claim on the warmer world that we live in. And the third world look at it, the developing world look at it and say, just because you got there first and locked in your share of the 1.1 degree warming that has already occurred, doesn't entitle you to grandparent that claim on the global commons in perpetuity. At least it's up for discussion as to how that global commons, which is the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb greenhouse gases, how that global commons should be shared.
Thanks, Rod. So what next for the Commission? Are you able to choose popular/effective targets for independent review, analysis, and report this to government? Or are you bound only by what the Minister is interested in?
Joe, you can go on that one.
Sure. So our work program is set out in the Zero Carbon Act. And coming up over the next couple of years, we have a number of key pieces of advice to give as dictated by the Zero Carbon Act. And of course, that was passed by Parliament, not the Minister of the day. So our next tranche of work coming up for delivery next year relates to advice to government on the second emissions reduction plan. So that's the one for the second emissions budget period. Following that, we've got advice to give on emissions budgets. So the next emission budget taking us out to 2040. We are reviewing in 2024, we are reviewing the targets, the 2050 targets to see whether they're fit for purpose. And that would, of course, include the 10% methane reduction by 2030, because that is part of that overall package of targets that Parliament set when it passed the Act. And we have annual advice on the settings of the emissions trading scheme, and actually our first go at that is coming out this month, and so that happens every year. On top of that, we're going to be establishing our both our monitoring role, so we'll be reporting annually on the country's progress and the adequacy of the government's plan for reducing emissions. And we are moving into also monitoring progress in relation to climate adaptation, which is an incredibly important part of this discussion, and which we increasingly need to focus on. In terms of requests from the Minister, there is a section in the Act that does allow the Minister to ask us bespoke questions as the need arises. And so we could also be supplementing our advice or doing additional pieces if requested to by the Minister over the next couple of years.
So just on that last one, that section of the Act is section 5K. So if you hear talk about 5K requests, so far the Minister has issued 2 of them. When they're issued, they are transparent. The terms of reference have to be agreed with the Commission. So it's not a direction by the Minister, it's agreement with the Commission. The terms of reference have to be published. And the 2 pieces of advice that have been requested under section 5K of the Commission in our first 2.5 years was one in respect of our nationally determined contribution, where we concluded that we had to do, quote, much more than the 36% reduction to be consistent with our Paris Agreement and its goals. And the second was the 5K request, which was to provide advice on what, if any, financial assistance should be provided to participants in an agricultural pricing system. So the Minister doesn't get just to pick up the phone and call Joe or me and say, I really want you to do a piece of work on this or that. Yeah, there's a very transparent process for that. And then there's a transparent process for the release of that advice.
Thanks, Rod. And we've probably got time just to squeeze in 2 more questions. So the first one, what has the Commission done to consult with farmers in developing this advice? And how has what you heard from farmers been reflected in this advice?
Joe, you can go on that one.
Sure. So we engaged with farmers in a number of ways. First of all, we attended the Hei Waka Ika Noa consultation events so that we could hear directly how Hei Waka Ika Noa were talking to farmers and the kinds of issues that are arising through that. We also had a series of targeted Zoom meetings with a range of farming, the farming sector, including farm advisors, farmers themselves. I think there was NGOs, and I forget, Charlie, you'll remember the full range of open Zooms that we did. And then on top of that, we commissioned a survey to go out to a range of farmers to gather evidence in terms of the readiness and the different views around emissions pricing. Charlie, do you want to add a bit about our webinars last year?
Yeah, so we did the public open Zoom in February, which was kind of like this, just to explain our task and our role and what the work we were doing. And we also held targeted workshops with NGOs, local government, rural professionals, and and a series of workshops with farmers earlier this year with a range of farmers from across the country, reflecting different farm types. So yeah.
And let me just add, Charlie, what those of you who have read our advice will see is that we then report back on what we heard from farmers. We don't necessarily debate each of the things. We very clearly heard from farmers that they did not like the idea of a processor levy because they felt that there was nothing they could do to get credit for lower emitting farm practices and land use. We heard very clearly from them that including each farm as a point of obligation in the ETS would be complicated and inconsistent with the split gas targets that had been said. And we agreed with them on both scores. We also heard from farmers that they desperately wanted to be treated fairly in their mind about if they were going to be charged for emissions, they should get credit for every sequestration. And of course, that as a fairness argument within a farming community, I can understand. But what we need to do is make sure that we make our emissions pricing system through the ETS as effective and robust as it can be. And that if we are going to deliver financial assistance for the transition, we do that in the best, most practical way of delivering either structural assistance to the entire sector or conditional assistance to groups within the sector in ways that support the transition. Don't simply mute the price effect or financial impacts so that we continue to have higher emitting agricultural products, practices, and land uses than we would otherwise have, and that we are already committed to paying the world for if we don't reduce our emissions as a country.
Thanks, Rod. And I would also like to clarify, we have some Māori case studies which are still being developed as well. So we've got time just to squeeze in one final question. Just bear with me 1 second. So obviously we've delivered our advice, Hawaka have delivered their proposals, and what are the next steps for agricultural emissions pricing?
So I think the next step is the officials will be providing advice to the government on our advice, the Hawaka Ekanoa proposal, and any other aspects of agricultural emission pricing from their own evidence and thinking. I'm sure that the industry bodies will be lobbying both officials and politicians to advocate for their sector position on various matters, and that's to be expected. That's completely part of how the system is set up to work. Whether or not there will be a specific structured formal consultation on a government proposal is a matter for the minister, not for us. But what we do know is under the Act, the government of the day will need to provide a report by the end of the year on how it proposes to price agricultural emissions from the 1st of January 2025.
Thank you, Rod. We're almost at time now, so I think we'll close off there. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined us today. And thanks to Rod and Joe for leading the session and for answering all of the questions. So enjoy the rest of your day, and we're going to hand over to Ben to close the session for us with a karakia.
Kia ora tātou, he karakia whakamutunga. Kia tātou katoa, te atu whai o tō tātua ariki a Hukaraiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake, amini. Kia ora.
Kia ora.